My name is Claire Abbott, and I'm 36 years old. I live in a tidy, unassuming house in a quiet suburb of Salt Lake City, a place defined by its wide streets and the distant silhouette of the Wasatch Mountains. For years, my life has been as predictable as the seasons here. But predictability feels different now. It feels like a cage. My husband Richard died last week. He was older, in his late 40s, and the heart attack was so sudden it felt more like an event in a movie than a reality I had to navigate. We'd lived in this house for nearly a decade, and in that time, I'd come to know our neighbors mostly through polite waves and brief pleasantries exchanged over the lawnmower's drone. Next door lives Leo Vance. He's 32, a man I've only ever known from a distance. He works as some kind of accountant, I think, and he's the definition of unassuming. He's not the guy you notice at a block party, but there's a gentleness in the way he tends to his small garden, and a kindness in his eyes when he'd catch me wrestling with the recycling bins. Richard and I were never close with him. Richard was always a man in motion, his mind perpetually on a business deal or a flight he had to catch. He was a whirlwind of ambition and distraction. Leo, in contrast, possessed a stillness, a calm that seemed to radiate from him even in the briefest of encounters. The funeral was last Tuesday. It was a blur of black suits, muted condolences, and the suffocating scent of lilies. I didn't reach out to Leo. I didn't feel it was appropriate. We were neighbors, not friends. But the day after, the silence in my house became a physical presence. It was a heavy blanket I couldn't throw off. Every tick of the clock echoed in the vast emptiness Richard had left behind, an emptiness that had, if I'm being honest, been growing for years. By 4 p.m, I couldn't stand it anymore. I was wandering through the rooms of my own home like a ghost when I looked out the window and saw the light on in his kitchen. Acting on an impulse I didn't fully understand, I grabbed my long black coat, pulled my hair back, and walked across the damp grass that separated our lives. I knocked on his door, my knuckles feeling foreign against the wood, a small cup of lukewarm tea trembling in my hand. He opened it, looking surprised to see me, dressed comfortably in a hoodie and sweatpants. His eyes, tired and red-rimmed, met mine. "Hi, Leo," I heard myself say, my voice a fragile whisper. "Do you mind if I come in for a minute?" He didn't hesitate, just stepped aside and let me in. He gestured toward his couch and offered to make me fresh tea, which I accepted gratefully. I didn't want to explain myself. I couldn't. I just needed to not be in my own house, surrounded by the ghost of a life that was no longer mine. I sat there, my hands clasped in my lap, watching the steam curl up from the mug he placed in front of me. The silence in his home was different from the silence in mine. His was peaceful, a comfortable absence of noise. Mine was a screaming void. After what felt like an eternity, the words finally found their way out. "It's too quiet next door," I whispered, the admission costing me more than I expected. I thought I could handle it, but I don't want to be alone right now. He simply nodded, his expression full of a quiet understanding that I desperately needed. He told me I didn't have to explain anything. We just sat there for a while, the simple act of sipping tea together in the late afternoon light feeling like a lifeline. It wasn't awkward. It was a strange and unexpected comfort. Eventually, the stories started to spill out of me, quiet confessions about Richard. I talked about how the last few years had been a slow erosion of our connection, how we'd become two separate people sharing a mortgage. We were roommates who occasionally shared a bed, the distance between us wider than the few inches of mattress. I wasn't weeping hysterically. It was more like a slow, painful release of pressure that had been building inside me for years. The truth was leaking out, drop by painful drop. I looked up and met his gaze, needing him to understand. "I know this must sound awful," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "But a part of me feels like I've already been grieving him for a long time. It's like I lost the man I married years before his heart actually stopped." I didn't know what I expected him to say, but he didn't offer empty platitudes or judgment. He just listened, his quiet attention a balm on a wound I hadn't realized was so raw. That seemed to be all I needed. As I finally stood to leave, my eyes swept across his living room. The stack of books on the coffee table, the worn armchair, the comfortable clutter of a life being lived. A faint, genuine smile touched my lips. "It's warm in here," I told him, and I meant it in every possible way. Then I was gone, stepping back across the lawn into my cold, empty house. But something fundamental had shifted. A fragile bridge had been built across the space between our two homes. The morning after my first visit to Leo's, I couldn't settle. The house felt even more oppressive than before. I had a mountain of paperwork to sort through, calls to make to insurance companies and banks, but my mind was a fog. All I could see was the image of his living room, the steam from our tea mugs, and the patient, non-judgmental look in his eyes. There was something about his quiet acceptance, the way he just sat with me in my raw, unfiltered honesty that had burrowed deep under my skin. It wasn't a romantic feeling. It was a profound sense of human connection that I hadn't realized I was starving for. I hadn't eaten a thing by the time noon rolled around. I was just staring blankly at an unopened letter when I heard a soft knock on my own front door. When I opened it, he was standing there. He wasn't wearing a coat, just jeans and a gray hoodie that seemed a size too big for him. He held 2 brown paper bags from a local deli, the familiar logo a small beacon of normalcy in my chaotic world. "I figured you might forget to eat," he said, offering a small, hesitant smile. "I almost did. I thought I'd bring lunch if that's okay." He didn't wait for my permission, just took a small step inside, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And somehow, it was. We decided to sit on the back patio, the one Richard had meticulously designed but we'd rarely used together. The sky was a uniform sheet of gray, and a cool breeze rustled the leaves in the trees, but the air felt clean and fresh against my skin. He handed me a turkey and Swiss sandwich, and we sat in a comfortable silence, unwrapping our lunches. I didn't feel the need to fill the quiet with chatter, and I was grateful he didn't either. I took small mechanical bites, my gaze fixed on the line of aspens at the edge of the yard, my mind a million miles away. It was me who finally broke the silence. "It's so strange," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I would be more shattered." I pictured myself waking up screaming or just unable to stop crying. But mostly I just feel hollow, like I'm watching my life happen to someone else. I felt his eyes on me, but I couldn't bring myself to look at him. I just kept staring at the trees. "I've had this weight in my chest for years, Leo. It was there long before Richard died. The grief started when we stopped being a we, when we started passing each other in the hallway like strangers." I let out a long, slow breath, surprised by my own candor. He just listened, letting me unpack the years of quiet loneliness. "We used to be so close," I continued, the memories feeling distant and faded. "I truly loved him, but his work became his life. The travel increased, the hours got longer, and the conversations dwindled to logistics. I started eating dinner alone more often than not, even on nights he was home. We were sleeping in the same bed, but it felt like we were on different continents. Finally, I turned to meet his gaze, my own eyes feeling heavy but clear. "Have you ever felt like you were slowly becoming invisible in your own life?" He gave a slight nod, not out of pity, but out of a deep, resonant empathy. He understood the loneliness I was describing, even if he hadn't lived it himself. A moment passed, and then a soft, almost embarrassed laugh escaped me. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to unload all of this on you. It's just, there's no one else to talk to." "You don't ever have to apologize for that," he said, his voice gentle but firm. Sometimes all you need is someone to sit with you. The gratitude that washed over me was so intense it almost brought tears to my eyes. For the next hour, we steered away from the heavy topics of grief and loss. We talked about trivial things, bad movies we both loved, our favorite coffee shops in the city, the time I tried to foster a stray cat that ended up terrorizing the neighborhood before vanishing a week later. I told him about Richard's obsession with perfectly manicured lawns, and he told me about a mortifying work email he'd once sent with a typo that read, "Pubic announcement." I laughed, a real, unrestrained laugh that started deep in my belly. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I felt a spark of the person I used to be. At one point, as we were talking, the back of my hand brushed against his on the small patio table. It was an innocent, fleeting touch, but a jolt went through me. It lingered for just a second too long, a silent acknowledgement passing between us before I gently pulled my hand away. A flicker of something, guilt, confusion, fear, crossed my face. "I should go," I said abruptly, standing up. The comfortable bubble we had created suddenly felt fragile, dangerous. "This is probably too soon. I don't want you to think I'm just using you as an emotional replacement." He stood as well. "You're not," he said, and I knew he meant it. I paused at the back door, turning to face him. "I just really didn't want to be alone today." He nodded, his eyes kind. "Then don't be. Anytime you need to talk, or just sit and not talk, my door is open." The air between us was thick with unspoken feelings. We both felt the shift, a nascent warmth and intimacy that neither of us had been looking for. I gave him a slow nod. "Thank you, Leo. Really." Then I turned and walked across the grass back to my silent house. As I walked, I hugged my arms to my chest, the wind catching in my hair. I knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that we had just crossed some invisible line. Nothing had happened, not really, but an unspoken connection had taken root between us, and I had a feeling it wasn't going to fade away. The following day began under a heavy gray sky that promised rain. I sat at my kitchen table, cradling a mug of coffee that had long gone cold, pretending to sort through a pile of mail. My thoughts were a tangled mess, constantly circling back to Leo. It wasn't just that he had brought me lunch, it was the profound sense of peace I felt in his presence. His words, his quiet empathy, the way he looked at me with a blend of compassion and simple acceptance, it all lingered. And then there was that brief touch, the brush of our hands on the table, a tiny moment that felt charged with a significance I wasn't ready to examine. Sometime after 1, I found myself standing at the window overlooking my backyard. I told myself I was just looking at the clouds, but my eyes were fixed on his house. And then I saw him, standing on the edge of his own patio, his arms crossed over his chest, looking out at the same dreary sky. He seemed so solitary, so thoughtful, and for a moment, I wondered if he was thinking about me too. I watched him for a few minutes, feeling a magnetic pull I couldn't explain. I spent another hour pacing my own living room, wrestling with myself. Going over there again felt like an imposition, a sign of weakness. But staying here, in this museum of a life that was over, felt like a slow suffocation. Finally, I couldn't fight the impulse any longer. The knock on his door felt both familiar and terrifyingly new. When he opened it, I was standing there in a simple navy blue sweater and black leggings. I hadn't bothered with makeup or jewelry. I didn't have the energy for pretense. I was just me, exhausted and raw. My eyes must have conveyed the depth of my turmoil, the silent battle I'd been waging all morning. "Can I come in?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Yeah," he said immediately, his voice soft as he stepped back to let me pass. I walked into his living room, the space already feeling like a sanctuary. I moved slower this time, my steps hesitant, as if I were trespassing on his kindness. I stopped in the middle of the room, my gaze sweeping over the familiar objects, searching for some kind of sign that I was doing the right thing. I wasn't planning on coming over, I admitted, my voice shaky. I've been going back and forth for the last hour, but I didn't know where else to go. You don't need a reason, he said gently, his words a comforting balm. I moved to the couch and curled up on one end, instinctively making myself smaller, trying to take up less space. He sat in the armchair across from me, giving me the room I needed. The only sounds were the distant hum of traffic and the steady ticking of a clock on his wall. I don't know how to be alone, I confessed into the quiet. My whole life, there's always been someone. I went from my parents' house straight to living with Richard. Now, it's just me. He nodded slowly. That's a hard adjustment. I let out a shaky breath. The thing is, I've felt alone for years, even when he was here. It's like I was mourning the end of our marriage long before he was actually gone. My words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken pain. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his focus entirely on me. That's a brutal kind of loneliness, he said, when someone is physically present but emotionally 1,000 miles away. His understanding pierced through my carefully constructed walls. I looked at him directly, my voice dropping even lower. Do you think it's wrong? That I don't feel guilty for being here? For talking to you like this? So soon after? He didn't answer right away, and I held my breath, terrified of his judgment. No, he said finally, his voice full of conviction. I don't think there's a timeline for grief or for connection. Sometimes people come into our lives exactly when we need them the most. That doesn't make it wrong. A wave of relief so powerful it almost made me dizzy washed over me. It was the permission I hadn't even known I was seeking. I just didn't expect to feel drawn to anyone right now, I whispered, the admission hanging vulnerably between us. Neither did I, he replied, his gaze unwavering. I looked down at my hands, twisting the hem of my sweater. I don't want to go back to my house tonight, not because I'm avoiding it, but because I feel like the walls are closing in. I feel like I'm going to suffocate if I have to sit in that silence again. It wasn't melodrama. It was the honest, desperate truth of a woman at the absolute end of her rope. You don't have to explain, he said quietly. If you need a place to breathe, you can have the guest room. I blinked rapidly, fighting back the tears that suddenly burned my eyes. I didn't expect you to say that. You're not alone, Claire. He said my name, and the sound of it, so gentle and sure, nearly broke me. I nodded slowly, and for the first time all day, a fragile smile touched my lips. Later that evening, he pulled clean sheets from a linen closet and made up the bed in his spare room while I sat in the living room, sipping chamomile tea he'd made for me. We didn't talk much, but the silence was a comfortable shared space. Before I went to bed, I felt I needed to thank him again. I found him in the kitchen, and there was no awkwardness, just a quiet closeness. Thank you, Leo, I said softly, for this, for not pushing, and for making me feel like a person again. Then, on an impulse, I stepped forward and wrapped my arms around him. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was a desperate human need for contact. My head rested against his shoulder, and his arms came around me, holding me with a steadiness that grounded me. It was the kind of hug that says, I'm here. You're safe. When we finally pulled apart, I whispered, good night, and disappeared down the hall before I could fall apart completely. I closed the guest room door and stood there in the dark, still feeling the solid warmth of his arms around me. I didn't sleep much, my mind reeling. I was acutely aware of him just a room away, of the incredible kindness he had shown me. A near stranger. This wasn't just a neighbor offering a place to crash. This was a man holding space for a woman who had just buried her husband. A woman who, for reasons she couldn't yet articulate, felt safer in his home than in her own. The walls of his house felt thin, every creak of the floorboards amplified, and my thoughts spun in a relentless loop. I kept replaying the hug in my mind. It was devoid of romance or drama, but it was profoundly honest and deeply human. It was the kind of contact you don't forget, not because of what it might lead to, but because of how desperately it was needed. When the first hint of gray light began to seep through the blinds, I finally gave up on sleep. The house was utterly still. I crept out of bed, moving slowly so as not to wake him, and made my way to the kitchen. I brewed a pot of coffee, the familiar aroma a small comfort, and stood by the window, wrapping my hands around a warm mug as the soft morning light washed over the backyard. About 20 minutes later, I heard his quiet footsteps in the hall. He appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a dark blue robe, his hair messy from sleep. His expression was calm, but his eyes were tired. He still looked beautiful, but in a new way, more real, more unguarded. "Morning," he said, his voice husky. "Hey," I replied with a small smile. "I made coffee." He nodded and took the mug I offered him. We stood there together for a long moment, sipping in a silence that felt not empty, but full of rest. Eventually, I sat down at his small kitchen table, pulling the blanket from the guest room tighter around my shoulders. I stared out the window for a while, before finally voicing the thought that had been consuming me. I have no idea what I'm doing. He sat across from me, his presence a quiet anchor. I don't think you're supposed to, Claire. You're just figuring it out 1 minute at a time. That's more than enough. I nodded slowly, absorbing his words. I keep thinking about how it felt yesterday, just sitting here, talking. It felt like I was breathing real air again. It felt like I reclaimed a tiny piece of myself. I looked at him then, my gaze direct and searching. Richard and we weren't a team anymore. We were just two strangers occupying the same address. I don't think I even realized how much of myself I had lost, how hollow I'd become, until I finally walked out of that house. I could tell he was truly listening, letting me find the words I needed to say. I came here yesterday because I couldn't stand the silence, and now I don't want to go back. Not yet. I ended up staying the entire day. It wasn't a conscious decision. It just happened. He made us scrambled eggs and toast for breakfast. I helped him fold a load of laundry, and we both laughed when I discovered a single, bright pink sock that had mysteriously infiltrated his whites. In the afternoon, we went for a slow, meandering walk around the neighborhood. We didn't hold hands, but our shoulders brushed against each other every now and then, small points of contact that felt both innocent and significant. The day unfolded with a gentle, unforced rhythm. That evening he made pasta with a simple tomato sauce and a side salad. We ate, and then ended up on his couch, a nature documentary playing quietly on the television. I tucked my feet up under me, cradling a cup of tea. He sat beside me, leaving a respectful but comfortable space between us. "It's strange," I said softly, breaking the long silence. "I feel peaceful here, like I'm allowed to just exist without any expectations. I haven't felt that in so long." He turned to face me. "You don't have to rush anything. There's no playbook for this." I looked up at him, my eyes searching his for reassurance. "Do you think it's wrong that I don't feel bad about being here?" I asked again, needing to hear it one more time. "No," he said, his voice a gentle murmur. "I think you're doing exactly what you need to do, and that's never wrong." My head, as if of its own accord, tilted and came to rest on his shoulder. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. His arm came around me, not in a possessive or suggestive way, but just as a steady, supportive presence. And in that quiet moment, something shifted palpably in the air between us. I lifted my head and looked at him, our faces now only inches apart. His eyes held mine, and I could feel the soft warmth of his breath. Slowly, tentatively, I leaned in. My lips met his in a kiss that was soft and careful, more of a question than a statement. It wasn't about passion or fireworks. It was about two lonely souls finding a moment of connection in the midst of pain. When I pulled back, I immediately whispered, "I'm sorry." "You have nothing to be sorry for," he replied, his voice just as quiet. We didn't kiss again. Instead, I leaned my head against his chest, and we stayed that way for what felt like hours, wrapped in a profound stillness. Something irreversible had changed, and though neither of us dared to name it, we both knew our lives were now intertwined. In the days that followed that quiet, transformative night, we were both cautious. The kiss had been gentle and hesitant, a question neither of us was quite ready to answer. We didn't fall into a whirlwind affair. Instead, we gave each other space, an unspoken acknowledgement that we both needed time to process everything that had happened. It wasn't an awkward distance, but a necessary one. I went back to my own house. I knew I couldn't hide in his forever. I had to face the quiet rooms, sort through the remnants of a life, and begin the difficult work of cleaning out the memories that clung to the walls. But a new ritual formed. Every morning, I would walk over to Leo's, and he would have coffee ready. We would sit on his couch, not always talking, just sharing the quiet start of the day. It became my anchor. Some days I would cry, letting the waves of grief wash over me in the safety of his presence. Other days, he'd make me laugh with some silly story, and the sound of my own laughter would feel like a small miracle. I felt myself slowly coming back to life. The oppressive weight on my chest began to lift day by day. I started smiling more, not just polite smiles for strangers, but genuine expressions of a lightness I thought I'd lost forever. And I could see a change in him too. A brightness returned to his eyes, a warmth that hadn't been there before. He was healing something in me, and in the process, I was seeing him come more alive as well. I was finding myself again, piece by tiny piece. It wasn't a fast or easy process, but with every shared coffee, every quiet conversation, I felt myself mending. Grief doesn't just disappear, but I was learning how to carry it, how to live alongside it without letting it consume me. Then, one Saturday about a month later, I took a huge step. I invited him to my house for dinner. He hadn't set foot inside since Richard died, and as the evening approached, a knot of anxiety tightened in my stomach. This was the space where my old life had unraveled, the house where Richard had taken his last breath. But inviting Leo in felt like a necessary act of reclamation, a step toward a new future. He arrived with a bottle of wine, and I had cooked a simple pasta, a meal that felt like comfort. We chose to eat on the back patio, the same place we'd shared sandwiches that first day. As the sun set, casting a warm golden glow over the yard, the evening air turned cool and pleasant. We didn't force conversation during dinner. We didn't have to. The silence was as comfortable as the words, punctuated by the soft clinking of our forks and the occasional shared smile. As the sky deepened to indigo and the patio lights cast a soft circle of light around us, I looked at him. The way he looked back at me was different. The pity was gone, replaced by something steadier, more certain. "I think I'm ready," I said, my voice clear and sure in the quiet of the evening. "Ready for what?" he asked gently. "Ready to let myself move forward," I explained, the words feeling momentous. "I've been so stuck, Leo, for so long. and I didn't know how to get out. But being with you, you've helped me see that it's okay to start again, that I don't have to be defined by what I've lost. His eyes softened, and the impact of my own words hit me. I hadn't planned to say all that, but it was the truest thing I had felt in years. He didn't speak. Instead, he reached across the table and took my hand in his. The warmth of his touch felt so right, so natural. He didn't need to say anything. I knew he understood. A real, open-hearted smile spread across my face, and in that moment, I realized just how far I had come. This wasn't just about my grieving process anymore. It was about building something new and beautiful from the ashes. I don't need to rush into anything, I continued, squeezing his hand. But when I picture my future now, you're in it. And that has to mean something. It was his turn to smile, a touch of nervous happiness in his eyes. I don't need to rush either, he said softly. We can take all the time we need. But I want to be there with you, Claire. I think we both deserve a chance at this. The silence that followed was filled with a profound and shared understanding. There were no more questions, only the quiet certainty that whatever was next for us, we would navigate it together. From that night on, everything was different, yet reassuringly the same. We didn't suddenly become a dramatic, passionate couple. We didn't need to be. We continued to build our relationship slowly, on a foundation of shared mornings, long talks, and the simple, quiet joy of companionship. We leaned on each other, a little more each day, finding strength in our shared vulnerability. Slowly but surely, we realized we had stumbled into something real, something deep and true and worth protecting. A few months later, waking up beside him felt like the most natural thing in the world. Our love wasn't the loud, chaotic type you read about in books. It was steady and kind, built not on grand gestures, but on thousands of small, quiet moments of support and understanding. I was happy, truly happy, and so was he. And I knew this wasn't just an ending to a story about grief. It was the beginning of a story about healing and about the beautiful, unexpected gift of a second chance.